You mentioned the recipes for a hedgehog and how to cook a bear. Let's talk about your book, which is titled Cooking in Europe, 1250 to 1650. Dr. Albala, in this segment, I want to speak with you about some recipes from history. But before I go there, I want to go to the first segment of our conversation. Uh, you were talking about books between 1450 to 1650, about 120 books that were, different. They talked
Mhm.
about different types of food. And, things go in and out of fashion, and the advice that are being given about different types of food. What I'm wondering is this: who are these for? Is it the rich? If we're talking about 1450 to 1650 and books, you already are excluding a
Yeah.
lot of people because one, they can't read, and two, books are so darn expensive. No one can afford, most people cannot afford to buy a book, let alone a book about cooking. If they bought a book, it'd be the
That
Bible.
that actually isn't true. But
It's
16th
not. Oh,
century
please go ahead.
printing is fairly cheap. The
Okay.
Reformation really wouldn't have happened, and vice versa. Getting people to read the Bible was part of the whole Reformation
Yeah,
agenda.
yeah, yeah.
But no, printing does become fairly cheap within 50 years of the invention of the printing press. So that's
Okay.
that's not true. But literacy is still fairly rare. And so your question is that who's reading these? And the way I like to describe it is if you could imagine that there are several different ways of thinking about food, different people who eat in different ways. Peasants eat what they can get their hands on and what's
My
traditional and
point
what's not.
exactly. Like, who's this
They
advice
might have
for?
luxuries every now and then for holidays, and they probably don't eat a whole lot of meat, whatever. Then the other very far extreme is the court, where they are eating the most extravagant luxuries, the spices, the cookbooks of the era like Bartolomeo Scapi includes recipes for hedgehog and bear, and there's things that why are they eating
Wow.
these? For because they're exotic and they're interesting, and he wants to
Bear?
do everything
Okay.
and all. He can teach you how to cook anything. Somewhere between these two, socially, I would say there's also a monastic diet, and there's a whole mess of books, which hopefully I'm going to come out with a book event someday about fasting, because I've done a whole lot of research on this. And there's people who think shouldn't be important and you should suffer and so forth. But anyway, it's about not food, really. But I would say there's a whole other way of thinking about food, which is eating for health, right? Dieting, maintaining, eating sensibly, eating right, as I called the book, I think. Now, who those people are, they're sometimes connected to court, but they're usually scholars and people who are wealthy enough to be able to choose what they can eat,
Yeah.
and they can obviously read, but they're professionals, they're middle class, they're people who reject the court, actually don't want to eat extravagantly the way the kings do, and they're
Yeah.
trying not to imitate them. They don't want to eat like the peasants, and they certainly don't want to eat like penitent monks and
Or
aesthetics.
fast.
But they carve out this different food ideology, which is eating for health. And there's still people like that, of course. Today they tend to be wealthy, middle class people with a lot of leisure and expendable income, and with a certain aesthetic that their first goal is personal health and maybe environment and animal rights and all this other stuff. That's a very ethical way of eating, right? I think
Yeah.
this is a precursor of that. Obviously, very different dimensions, and the details are all different. But socially, it's people who are just below the
The
elites.
court, the nobility.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, you mentioned the recipes for a hedgehog and how to cook a bear. Let's talk about your book, which is titled Cooking in Europe, 1250 to 1650. When I was reading a review of this book, I came across examples of recipes from that period: hemp seed soup, digestive pottage, carp fritters, frog pie, counterfeit snow, nuns bozzolati. Do you care to talk about any of these?
These are all great. So I've cooked these.
Oh, you have
Yes, of course.
frog pie.
Yeah, totally. So
Oh,
so
wow.
the hemp pie, if I remember, is from Platina, Bartolomeo Sacchi, who was papal first um, librarian of the Vatican Library. He's actually, we know exactly what he looked like. There's a painting of him by Melozzo Forli. But anyway, he didn't write these recipes himself. He stole them basically from a guy named Martino of Como. And he acknowledges him in one line somewhere in the book where he says, my friend, everything I know about cooking, I learned from Martino. He didn't say that he actually copied the recipes directly, but
Yeah.
he did. In any case, the hemp, he means flaxseed. It's not marijuana. It's not, it's
Yeah.
not, not
I got
flaxseed.
excited there for a
Hemp seed.
second.
Hemp
Okay.
seed you can buy in a health food store.
Yeah.
You grind it up and it's funny because the word he uses in Latin is cannabis. So people look at this and they
Interesting.
go, pot brownies in the 15th century, right?
Hence my question. Yeah.
It's not though. It's
Does
not.
it taste good?
No, it's like when you eat things like I don't know. Have you ever had hemp seeds? You could put them in. They make butter out of it. They do it. No, it doesn't taste good. I don't think so. And in fact, interestingly, after he gives the recipe, he said this is going to harm your head. So,
So don't have it.
and he does this all the time. Actually, he gives a recipe for eggplant, and he said this is so bad, feed it to your enemies.
I love it. A recipe not for you, but for your enemies. Let's talk about frog pie. What is that?
Is this from Mrs. Bugo? I'm remembering back from 2003 when this book came out. So frogs are not, they're not unusual and they're not even strange tasting. The way I usually, I mean, you can cook a whole frog, but mostly people take the legs off and pull the skin off, and I hate to say it tastes like chicken, but it sort of does. It's very light white meat, and using it in a pie is not really that unusual. I mean, the last time I really went all out on frog, I did a recipe for my noodle soup book, and I thought, if you make like a stock out of bones, why not do that out of frog bones? Like make a proper frog stock, and take the meat off and bread it, and like you would do a katsu, chicken katsu or pork katsu, and then put it on noodles that have some seaweed in it. And I wanted to sort of bring out the frog flavor. And it sounds bizarre, I know, but it was just exquisite. It was really just very delicate,
Wow.
lovely, slightly fishy flavor.
Did you share with anyone?
No, but it's in the book. The recipe's in there, and a picture of it.
What is counterfeit snow?
So counterfeit snow was very, very popular in the middle of the 16th century, the 1540s or so. And it's basically like it's kind of like a meringue. It's whipped up cream and egg whites and sugar and usually rose water and things. And very interestingly, some of the authors didn't have a whisk. They actually took a stick, cut it four square, and splayed out the end and used that as a whisk, which I found really amazing. But what they would do is that they would whisk up this stuff and then pass it through a colander so it falls like snow over an apple with a little branch of rosemary stuck in the top. So it has this kind of lovely little winter scene. It's also mentioned in Giordano Cardano mentions, he's a physician and a very interesting figure, called it lactis spuma. So it was kind of the foam of milk is how you translate that. But it's sort of like a precursor to ice cream in popularity. Everyone was really into that.
Next time I have ice cream or frozen yogurt, I'll have to think about that counterfeit snow. That could be a brand for a new type of ice cream. Let's talk about chicken and beef. You mentioned both. We talked about beef actually a little bit more. The way I understand it, eating chicken is not something that was prevalent. Now we can go to Costco, there's chicken easily. Going back even 90 years ago, 80 years ago, am I misinformed on this?
Yeah, I think so. Chicken is not, if you're poor, no, you don't eat your chicken because it lays you eggs, right?
Exactly.
And there are not specific layers and fryers, and they don't specify them the way the modern chicken industry does.
Yeah.
And ideally you have chickens that are running outside in the yard and that taste good, but if you're wealthy enough, they preferred capon. Capon is a castrated rooster, which grows really big. It gets a really sort of muscular texture to the flesh. It's much more interesting than chicken, and they're older. They're usually a few years old. So people would usually make stock out of capon, and serve it. There's a very interesting dish made out of it also called blancmange, and you're gonna you're gonna be frightened by this. So imagine taking the chicken, poaching it, the capon, and shredding the pieces so you have a very fine strings, and
Uh-huh.
pounding it with sugar and almond milk and sometimes rose water. It turns white. It's called blancmange, and it's actually the ancestor of the modern blancmange that would be almond and a sweet dessert. But this one is based on chicken, and you're thinking, what, sweet chicken
Yeah.
pudding kind of
Yeah,
thing?
yeah, yeah.
And when I've made this with people, I tell them, okay, taste this, put it in your mouth. Don't have any preconceived notions of what is going on and what it's supposed to be like. And I say, what does this remind you of? Think hard, because the flavor will be very, very familiar to you. It's chicken nuggets, which are sweet, which are very sweet. It's
Really?
mushy, it's string, it doesn't have the breading on the outside, but it tastes like the filling of chicken nuggets.
Going back to my question about chicken, I'm still not clear on this. Was it available to all people to have chicken, let's say lower middle class or peasants? So that
Yes.
became a thing in the 20th century. Is that correct? Or
Well, the popularity of chicken has gone up, 20-fold in the past 50
yeah,
years. But chickens are around, and people who are poor don't eat much meat at all, so
yeah,
that's not really a question. But if you have money, chicken would certainly be, a common thing you'd eat as a protein. Pork, it depends on where you are also.
of
In
course.
Italy, chickens are usually served old in the form of soup, not a young chicken, not like a cutlet or anything like that.
Yeah,
But pork, especially preserved pork, salamis and guanciale and culatello and hams and of all different kinds. That's the way you slaughter a pig in the fall, and then you cure as much of it as you can. You eat the sausages quickly, but it's I think the more common food for peasants would be pork.
how about beef? Was beef something that masses could eat, or was that something that
It's something you didn't want to eat if you could avoid it, because remember, these are working animals, right? They're
yeah,
there
yeah,
to pull plows, and by the time they're that old that you're going to eat them, they need to be boiled to death, and boiling is the common way to cook them in the cookbooks. It's very rarely used.
interesting.
I mean, they do. There's some grilling. I'm thinking of Scapi has rolled like thin slices of beef that are rolled around fillings and then grilled on a skewer. It exists there, but like the whole idea of having a steak, it's not there at all. And
But
remember, they're eating with their fingers, for example. That's another thing. So
oh, ho, ho, ho,
so you're
wow.
not going to have a big hunk of steak. You'd have to pick up and bite. It's not.
Interesting, interesting. Um, I want to talk about your book, which is titled Cooking in Europe, 1250 to 1650 for a second. Is there anything special about that 400-year time period, 1250 to 1650?
There isn't. No, the reason I did that, well, it is sort of unified in that the earliest written manuscript cookbooks come out about there, and the cuisine changes about 1650. But the way I conceived it, I edited this food series at the time for Greenwood Press, and I wanted to do historic books about historic cooking in that series. I got Ivan Day to do the 1650 to 1950, I think. He's a very famous food historian also in Britain. And I did the first half, he did the second half, which was a lot of fun. I think we also did 19th century America. We did, I don't know, maybe a dozen books in that series on historic cooking. So I thought that the 1250 to 1650 kind of made sense because they're cookbooks. It's based on cookbooks.
As you were explaining the reasons behind this time period and your collaboration with a scholar from Britain, this just it's natural for me to follow up with this question. How did you get into this subject, the history of food?
Well, yeah,
Where,
I like to tell this story. So if people have heard it before, pardon me. It's I went to graduate school at Columbia, intending to do Renaissance cultural history, social history kind of thing. I did not have a topic I knew I wanted to write about. I don't know. I was interested in a lot of different things. And my advisor at the time, Gene Rice, said, "Why don't you walk across the park to the New York Academy of Medicine?" And I was like, "What? Why? Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
I've never showed any interest in this." And I said, "Why did you suggest that?" And he said, "Well, they have comfortable chairs." And he was being absolutely serious. It was a great library. They have, and they will take care of you, and the chairs are comfortable. There won't be anyone else in there, so it'll be quiet. You make an appointment, and I literally took his advice. I went there. I opened up one filing cabinet. This is before computers, and Margaret Barclay Wilson, was a collector in the early 20th century who decided she wanted to own every book written on the history of nutrition. And she did. And she donated them all to the New York Academy of Medicine. And they were all just sitting there. So I literally did all my research in one room. And it took
That's a
me
great
3
story. You
years.
stumbled on this.
Yeah, totally by accident. And I thought, and I also got very good advice. My advisor said, you have to, if you're going to pick a topic, do something you really love. It has to, because if you get bored with it halfway through, you're in big trouble.
Yeah.
And I've always been interested in food. I've always loved cooking. And I saw this and I said, well, this is kind of nutritional theory was really totally about food. And I thought this will be fun. It was a challenge because it was written in 6 or 7 different languages. So that was, I do know how to read those, but it took a lot of time to take notes, to really absorb. And I think the most interesting thing about that whole process, this took from about 1989 to 93 or 4, somewhere in there. And is that when you read something often enough, you start to internalize the information, the advice, you start to believe it. So for those years, I actually had a humoral body. I mean, if I had cucumbers, I would get phlegmatic humors. I knew exactly what these guys were
That
talking
is
about.
wild.
Reading it all day. And psychosomatically, I just sort of, I became humoral. I became a 16th century body. I'm over it now, thank God.
Thank
But
God.
it was very, very strange process. And in fact, I kind of walked away from the whole thing. And I got a job in 94 here at the University of the Pacific, where I still am, same office. And I was, sort of spending most of my time writing my courses, doing, committee work, whatever it was. And the guy who was the director of general education said, "Would you be interested in this job?" And I said, "Well, maybe, but what's your advice? What should I do?" And I was coming up for tenure and hadn't really written anything. And he said, "Oh, no, you don't want to do this. Forget this program. You need to write a book. You need to get published if you want tenure." And I was like, "Oh, okay." This was 1999. I submitted this manuscript to University of California Press. They took a really long time on it. It didn't come out until 2002. I don't know why. University presses are really slow, but that was just under the wire for me to get tenure. And I thought, this whole writing book thing, this is really fun.
You've written
And
many books, yeah.
another one the next year, and another one the next year, another one. So I'm actually, gosh, I've been at Pacific for 28, 29 years. That's how many books I've written. So, some of them are edited collections, encyclopedias, translations. But
that's a wonderful story.
20
years. You said these books were written in several different languages, and you speak them all?
Some of them are not spoken. So classical Latin, some people do speak it. I don't know how they do it.
Do you understand? How many languages do you read?
So it was, well, it's kind of an accident how this happened. So I studied French in high school, which was lovely, and I'm pretty fluent in French. And then I got to college and I wanted to do Russian because I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And I can still speak Russian. I don't know why, because I had a teacher who was like, motion takes accusative. She banged it into our heads, the Russian. So I can't read any Russian, but I can speak a little, which is weird. And then I went back to French. Then I had to take Italian because I wanted to do the Renaissance. I did Latin. I did German because at grad school at Columbia, everyone had to do German. And the saddest thing about German was I had a professor who was beautiful. She was just stunningly lovely. I sat in the front row, hung on her every word, passed the proficiency exams, no trouble, and then proceeded to forget everything. And I've never
that is sad. You can't impress her now.
That's
Okay,
one of my languages. Anyway,
that's
and Spanish and
that's
Portuguese.
you're a genius. That's
Thank
very
you.
impressive. Dr. Albala, let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Albala as we get into the perspective.